The room was filled with the low hum of confident voices, punctuated by occasional laughter. German generals leaned back in their chairs, sipping cognac, dismissing the reports that came in from the front lines. Allied bombing campaigns, they claimed, were exaggerated at best, impossible at worst. Cities, they believed, were safe behind their walls. Their careful planning, their intelligence, their strategies, all of it rendered the notion of destruction laughable. And yet, outside those fortified offices, the world was shifting in ways they could not yet perceive. The calm confidence of the generals formed a sharp contrast to the unseen threat hovering silently above the rooftops, a tension that lingered in the air like static before a storm. For the viewers, this juxtaposition immediately triggers curiosity. How could such brilliant minds, steeped in logic and experience, fail to recognize the danger that loomed just beyond their perception? The narrative does not linger solely on historical facts, but moves into the human mind, exploring how underestimation and overconfidence are not merely errors of strategy, but deeply rooted psychological patterns. These generals, for all their intelligence, were prisoners of their own biases. They relied on assumptions, comforting routines, and selective attention, blind to the possibility that the very reports they mocked might carry a kernel of truth. This is a reflection of a broader human tendency to misjudge risks, ignore warning signs, and convince ourselves of invulnerability. By placing the audience in the general's perspective, viewers begin to sense the tension between knowledge and perception, the gap between confidence and reality, and the subtle ways in which overthinking or underestimating can shape decisions. At the same time, civilians below, unaware of the discussions above, lived in a delicate balance of daily routines and subtle fears. Smoke rising in the distance, distant explosions, and the occasional warning siren hinted at danger, yet the full scale of the threat remained obscured. The contrast between the general's dismissive calm and the mounting, invisible peril outside mirrors the inner turmoil that many of us experience in life, the dissonance between what we believe and what reality may deliver. For the audience, this duality creates suspense, empathy, and reflection. Questions arise naturally. How often do we ignore signs of danger? How often do we trust our own judgment over evidence? How often does overconfidence blind us to the risks before us? This introduction establishes the central psychological theme of the story, the peril of underestimation and the cognitive biases that fuel it, while creating an immersive, suspenseful atmosphere. It invites viewers aged 16 to 35 who are interested in psychology, self-improvement, and mental health to reflect on both historical events and their personal experiences. By the end, the stage is set, curiosity is piqued, and a question lingers in the mind. How can even the most brilliant minds misjudge the obvious? This smoothly prepares the audience to enter the next section, where the context, characters, and environment are laid out in vivid detail, building the foundation for the tension and conflict to come. The dawn rose slowly over the cities of Germany, casting a muted glow across rooftops that seemed untouched by the turmoil to come. From the vantage point of the general's offices, the morning appeared ordinary. Smoke from factories, the distant chime of bells, the quiet march of daily routines. Inside these fortified buildings, reports from intelligence officers lay stacked neatly on polished desks, detailing the progress of Allied bombing campaigns. Each report carried numbers, coordinates, predictions of potential destruction. Yet the generals, men trained in strategy and command, read these dispatches with a sense of detached amusement. Their laughter, low and confident, echoed across the walls, mocking what they perceived as exaggeration. To them, cities were fortified, defenses were sufficient, and the enemy's reach limited. The contrast between this calm, almost arrogant confidence and the reality hovering above, invisible, silent, and relentless, created a tension that was palpable even to an observer. Meanwhile, across the city streets, life continued with a precarious sense of normalcy. Families moved about their routines, children played in the squares, and shopkeepers arranged their wares. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms of life, there was an undercurrent of anxiety. Mothers glanced skyward, noticing the distant hum of aircraft engines or the faint shadow of planes on the horizon. Workers whispered of explosions miles away, their imaginations filling in the gaps. Civilians were aware of the possibility of danger, even if distant and unpredictable. The general public's fear contrasted sharply with the general's dismissive calm, highlighting a profound human tendency. We are often more attuned to immediate, visible threats than to abstract or statistical warnings. This section begins to explore the psychological frameworks at play. Confirmation bias, where the generals only acknowledged information that reinforced their sense of security, and normalcy bias, which kept them from imagining the catastrophic potential of the Allied campaigns. Allied strategists, on the other hand, worked with precision and calculated risk, understanding both the power and limitations of their capabilities. They plotted routes, analyzed weather patterns, studied defenses, and anticipated countermeasures. Their intelligence suggested that destruction was possible, inevitable even, yet the German leadership refused to internalize these signals fully. Here, the audience is invited to witness the clash of rational planning against emotional complacency. A structured, evidence-based strategy meets the rigid defenses of overconfidence. Descriptions of airfields, hangars, and preparation routines provide a sensory backdrop, immersing the viewer in the machinery of war, the clatter of mechanics, the smell of fuel, the whir of engines ready to lift into the skies. Within this environment, smaller narratives emerge. A young officer pores over maps, noting the inconsistencies between observed damage reports and official dismissals. His anxiety is quiet, but persistent, a reflection of the intuitive mind sensing risk that the rationalized mind refuses to accept. Civilians, too, begin to perceive anomalies, lights flickering in distant cities, distant booms that seem out of place, smoke curling from unexpected locations. Each minor disruption subtly undermines the general's confidence, introducing cracks in their otherwise unshakable demeanor. For the audience, these small signs act as foreshadowing, drawing attention to the slow accumulation of evidence that eventually cannot be ignored. Psychological hooks emphasize how humans tend to rationalize away anomalies to maintain comfort and order. Even when danger looms, the general's interactions reveal much about human cognition. Under perceived control, they dismiss lower-ranking officers who express concern, using phrases that convey certainty and authority. The reports are fraught. They insist, "Our cities are secure. There is nothing to fear." Yet even in their confident tone, subtle signs of unease appear. A pause before responding, a tightened jaw, a glance toward the window at distant clouds that might conceal aircraft. These micro-expressions communicate the tension between conscious confidence and subconscious doubt, a dynamic the audience can intuitively sense. Viewers recognize these patterns in their own lives, moments when overconfidence masks an inner recognition of risk, when pride or routine blinds perception to reality. Across the landscape, civilians experience the effects of war indirectly but profoundly. Fires in neighboring towns, shortages of supplies, and the sporadic sound of explosions create an atmosphere of uncertainty. Families begin to develop coping mechanisms. Children are kept indoors during certain hours. Nightly conversations become cautionary tales, and community networks form to share news and warnings. These human behaviors mirror psychological responses to perceived threat, heightened vigilance, preparation, and social bonding in the face of uncertainty. The contrast between the civilian's tangible fear and the general's abstract dismissal deepens the tension for the viewer, creating empathy for the vulnerable while maintaining suspense about the consequences of misjudgment. In parallel, historical context frames the scale of potential destruction. Factories producing weapons and machinery, railways moving troops and supplies, and dense urban centers all serve as strategic targets. Allied intelligence recognizes these vulnerabilities, yet the German leadership continues to underestimate the accuracy and reach of their enemy. Here, contrast framing is critical. The viewer sees the meticulous calculations of the attackers, juxtaposed with the complacency of those in power. This framing reinforces the psychological themes of underestimation and overconfidence, inviting reflection on human bias and flawed perception. As minor incidents accumulate, unexplained fires, intercepted messages, sporadic air raids, small cracks begin to appear in the general's previously unshakable confidence. These early signs, though not yet catastrophic, are sufficient to introduce tension. The audience experiences a growing anticipation, understanding that the gap between perception and reality is narrowing. The subtle shift from dismissive calm to uneasy vigilance lays the groundwork for the rising tension and conflict that will dominate the next section. By observing the interplay between rationality, bias, and emotion, viewers gain insights not only into historical events, but also into their own cognitive patterns. The hum of activity in the German command centers began to shift subtly as reports from the front lines arrived with increasing frequency. What had once been dismissed as minor skirmishes or exaggerated accounts of minor damage now took on a more insistent tone. Intelligence officers, once ignored, now approached their superiors with hurried urgency, detailing the increasing precision of Allied bombers. The generals, though outwardly calm, could not entirely suppress the tension creeping into their interactions. Small hesitations, the slight narrowing of eyes, the uncharacteristic tapping of fingers on polished desks, these micro-movements betrayed an undercurrent of unease beneath their confident facades. The contrast between the outward displays of authority and the private stirrings of doubt created a tension that the viewer could almost feel. Suspense mounted not only because of the historical context, but because the human mind instinctively recognizes the collision between perceived control and the unpredictability of external forces. Across the cities, civilians felt the tension in more visceral ways. Children, once allowed to play freely in the streets, were now kept close to their homes. Mothers and fathers listened intently to distant sounds, trying to distinguish between the ordinary noises of a bustling city and the ominous hum of approaching aircraft. Markets and shops, once vibrant, took on a quiet, anticipatory tone as people rushed to gather provisions, fearing the worst. Every small disruption, a sudden scream, the whistle of a distant engine, a shadow passing over the rooftops, amplified a collective anxiety that had begun as a faint undercurrent. The narrative here creates empathy for the civilians. Their fear is relatable, immediate, and tangible, allowing the audience to feel the tension rather than merely observe it. Contrast framing emerges naturally. The general's intellectual detachment versus the civilian's raw emotional response, confidence versus vulnerability, rational planning versus instinctual fear. Within the military command, internal conflict escalated. Officers who had previously been sidelined for expressing caution pressed their warnings with increased urgency. Maps sprawled across desks displayed areas at risk, targets hit in previous raids, and the emerging patterns of destruction. Even the generals, steadfast in their initial skepticism, could no longer completely ignore the data. Anxiety began to manifest as a creeping doubt. What if the reports were accurate? What if their assumptions about the enemy's limitations were flawed? This internal tension, the interplay between authority and doubt, mirrors the psychological experience of many viewers, moments when prior confidence is shaken by new information, prompting reflection on their own blind spots. Allied bombers, high above, moved with meticulous precision, their silhouettes barely visible against the pale morning sky. The sound of their engines, at first distant and almost comforting in its regularity, grew louder, more insistent. Civilians peered through windows, noting the shadows gliding across streets, the flutter of birds scattering in panic. Each flight became a reminder of vulnerability, a tangible signal that the safety once assumed was an illusion. The audience experiences this through immersive, descriptive storytelling. The narrator paints the visual and auditory details so that viewers can almost feel the vibrations. hear the distant explosions, and sense the rising panic. Tension is heightened through contrast. Where once generals had laughed, now they measured words carefully, anticipating questions they might not yet ask. Discussions in command rooms grew longer, more deliberate, as every choice and assumption was scrutinized. The calm certainty that had defined their strategy began to fracture, replaced by moments of hesitation. This contrast between former confidence and emerging fear creates suspense, keeping the audience engaged while reinforcing the psychological hook. Overconfidence can blind even the most intelligent individuals to reality. Outside, small yet telling signs of danger multiplied. Factories shut down early as air raid warnings sounded. Streets emptied quickly, leaving behind a ghostly stillness punctuated by the occasional distant blast. Families huddled together in cellars and basements, clutching one another and holding their breaths at every unusual sound. This depiction emphasizes the escalation of external conflict and mirrors internal anxieties. The audience, witnessing both perspectives, experiences empathy, suspense, and the psychological tension of waiting for inevitable consequences. Inside the command centers, subtle power struggles emerged. Younger officers, more aware of technological advancements in aerial warfare, quietly challenged the assumptions of their superiors. They cited statistics, analyzed recent raids, and suggested modifications to defensive strategies. The older generals, proud of their experience and prior successes, resisted, often dismissing the concerns as overcautious. This dynamic creates dramatic tension. The viewer observes the clash between experience and innovation, tradition and adaptation, hubris and caution. The psychological hook is clear. Humans often resist new evidence that challenges entrenched beliefs, a pattern recognizable in personal and professional contexts alike. As days progressed, bombing raids became more frequent and precise. The psychological impact on civilians intensified. Children no longer played outdoors, workplaces operated in fear, and the nightly sleep of ordinary people was punctuated by explosions that shook windows and rattled nerves. Mental strain mounted, not just from the immediate threat, but from the uncertainty, the unpredictability of timing, location, and intensity. The narrative emphasizes this emotional tension, using contrast framing, the predictability of routines versus the sudden chaos of destruction, the assumption of safety versus the intrusion of danger. Generals, forced to acknowledge minor damages, began to show signs of internal conflict. Publicly, they maintained composure, issuing statements that reassured the population. Privately, however, whispers of doubt circulated. Strategic meetings became tense exercises in persuasion, with evidence from intelligence officers weighed against years of ingrained confidence. The audience observes this tension between public and private selves, a contrast that resonates psychologically. Humans often mask inner uncertainty behind outward confidence, a pattern familiar in daily life, relationships, and professional settings. The narrative continues with escalating suspense. Each bombing raid becomes more unpredictable, and the cumulative effect of repeated assaults begins to undermine the general's previously unshakable belief in security. Civilians experience mounting terror as fires consume buildings, smoke fills the streets, and distant sirens grow more frequent. The tension between control and chaos, confidence and fear, is now at its peak. The audience is drawn into the experience, emotionally invested in both the historical events and the broader psychological themes, how underestimation, overconfidence, and denial can lead to catastrophic consequences. Finally, the section reaches a pivotal moment. A massive bombing strike, unprecedented in scale and precision, shatters the general's disbelief. Explosions rock entire districts. Smoke and fire rise to the sky, visible even from command centers thought to be safe. The narrative slows here, emphasizing the psychological weight of realization. The gap between perception and reality has collapsed. Civilians and soldiers alike confront the immediacy of danger, and the audience is left with a profound sense of tension, empathy, and suspense. This sets the stage perfectly for the climax, where consequences, revelations, and emotional breakthroughs will dominate the narrative. The city was unrecognizable. Flames licked the sky, twisting towers of smoke into grotesque shapes that blurred the line between destruction and surreal artistry. Streets that had once thrummed with life were now rivers of debris, punctuated by the echoes of collapsing buildings and distant sirens that seemed to pierce the very soul. The sheer scale of devastation forced the generals into a confrontation with reality that their arrogance had long denied. Their offices, once bastions of control, were now front row seats to chaos. Reports that had seemed abstract, numbers on paper, were transformed into visceral evidence. Entire districts erased, families displaced, strategic assets obliterated. In that moment, they could no longer rely on denial, rationalization, or selective attention. The narrative plunges the audience into this overwhelming tension, making them feel the magnitude of misjudgment and its emotional consequences. Generals, once confident and dismissive, were forced to navigate a rapidly deteriorating situation. Decisions that had been simple and procedural became moral and existential dilemmas. Should they continue to pursue rigid strategies that had proven ineffective, or should they adapt in real time, acknowledging the scale of error? Their overconfidence, once a shield, now felt like chains, binding them to a worldview that reality had already dismantled. Micro-expressions revealed cracks in pride, clenched jaws, rapid breathing, eyes darting from reports to the devastated cityscape outside. The contrast between empowerment and regret, between pride and vulnerability, was stark, offering a psychological window into the human cost of cognitive bias. For the audience, this is more than history. It is a mirror reflecting the ways in which confidence, unchecked by humility, can blind even the most competent individuals. Inside the cities, civilians faced a parallel reckoning. Families clung together in basements, improvising shelters beneath crumbling buildings, listening to the distant roar of bombers overhead. Children's cries punctuated the air, a haunting soundtrack to the inferno consuming their streets. Smoke filled lungs and eyes, adding physical discomfort to emotional terror. In these moments, the narrative emphasizes the contrast between the general's strategic panic and the civilian's raw, survival-driven fear. This layering of perspectives creates a multidimensional tension, drawing the audience into empathy with both groups while maintaining suspense. As the bombing campaigns reached their zenith, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Reports detailed critical infrastructure lost, communication lines severed, transportation networks destroyed, factories burned to ashes. The generals, who had once laughed at the notion of threat, were now faced with the tangible consequences of their underestimation. Each figure on a report sheet, a bombed factory, a ruined neighborhood, became a symbol of cognitive error. The psychological weight of their misjudgment pressed heavily upon them. Viewers experience a cathartic mix of horror and reflection, recognizing that even minor miscalculations in perception and judgment can yield catastrophic outcomes. In command centers, urgent debates erupted. Officers argued over responses, contingency plans, and evacuations. The generals had to reconcile their prior hubris with new realities. Some admitted error, others refused, clinging to pride even as it threatened the lives under their authority. This juxtaposition, insight versus ignorance, acknowledgement versus denial, enhances the narrative tension. The audience is invited to reflect on moments in their own lives when admitting mistakes was painful yet necessary, and the cost of refusing to adapt was steep. Amid the chaos, critical decisions were made that would define the immediate aftermath. Evacuations were ordered, resources reallocated, and emergency strategies implemented, often with frantic improvisation. These moments illustrate how human resilience and adaptability emerge under pressure. Even in the wake of catastrophic misjudgment, the narrative portrays these choices poetically, highlighting the tension between empowerment and regret. The same minds that underestimated danger now scramble to restore order, salvaging what they can while grappling with guilt and the knowledge that prior arrogance amplified suffering. The emotional intensity of the climax is amplified by vivid imagery, fires reflected in shattered windows, smoke curling like phantom fingers through streets, people moving like shadows through rubble-strewn avenues. The audience is immersed in both sensory detail and emotional resonance. Contrast framing remains central. The general's internal storm versus the civilian's external chaos, logic versus instinct, authority versus helplessness. These juxtapositions maintain suspense while emphasizing psychological themes, particularly the consequences of underestimating risk and ignoring evidence. Human reactions during these hours of devastation are varied and revealing. Some officers collapse under pressure, overwhelmed by the combination of responsibility, fear, and guilt. Others channel their anxiety into decisive action, demonstrating how stress can elicit both vulnerability and heroism. Civilians display extraordinary resilience. Families support one another. Strangers aid neighbors, and small acts of courage punctuate the larger narrative of destruction. The storytelling emphasizes that in moments of crisis, contrasting emotional responses illuminate the full spectrum of human psychology. Viewers are invited to witness both despair and hope, recognizing the complex interplay of emotion, cognition, and behavior. The psychological impact of this climax extends beyond the immediate events. The generals, once insulated by position and authority, now confront the tangible consequences of cognitive biases, confirmation bias, normalcy bias, and overconfidence. Each misjudgment, each assumption that ignored evidence, now appears in stark relief against the backdrop of obliterated cities. The audience is prompted to reflect on similar patterns in their own lives, times when overconfidence blinded them, when assumptions went unchallenged, when warnings were dismissed. This engagement deepens empathy and heightens the emotional stakes, making the climax psychologically compelling. Finally, amid the inferno, there is a moment of collective recognition. The generals understand that their previous arrogance is not merely a personal failing, but a systemic flaw, one that shaped decisions, amplified risk, and magnified suffering. Civilians, in parallel, begin to process survival, grief, and adaptation. The narrative pauses here, allowing the audience to absorb the full impact of events before moving toward resolution. It is a reflective, poetic interlude, emphasizing lessons learned amid chaos and preparing the viewer for the emotional closure and thematic reflection of the following section. This turning point, the apex of tension and emotion, sets the stage for the resolution. The audience has journeyed through fear, suspense, and the shock of realization alongside generals and civilians alike. The psychological hooks remain central: reflection on overconfidence, recognition of cognitive bias, and contemplation of human resilience under extreme pressure. By the end of this section, viewers are primed to witness recovery, adaptation, and the profound lessons that arise from confrontation with reality, seamlessly leading into Section 4, the resolution and aftermath. The morning after the devastation arrived with a quiet that was almost alien. Streets that had once been alive with activity now were the slow rhythm of cautious rebuilding. Smoke still lingered above the city, rising like ghostly reminders of the chaos that had engulfed it, but the sense of immediate danger had subsided. In these quiet hours, the human capacity for resilience became apparent. Civilians emerged from shelters, assessing the damage, helping one another, and quietly mourning losses. Their eyes, once filled with terror and uncertainty, now held a mixture of determination and tentative hope. In this transitional space, the narrative emphasizes transformation, the shift from fear to action, from chaos to deliberate effort, and from helplessness to agency. The audience is invited to reflect on the enduring strength of the human spirit. Even in the face of immense adversity, generals, once figures of unshakable authority, now confronted the consequences of their previous underestimation. In private moments, They wrestled with guilt, regret, and the bitter awareness that their overconfidence had contributed to human suffering. Yet alongside this emotional weight, they began to recognize patterns, biases, and errors in judgment that had previously gone unnoticed. Their evolution was gradual, a process of reflection and acceptance. Meetings that had once been dominated by confident assertions of control became spaces of inquiry and humility, where officers openly discussed what went wrong and how similar mistakes could be prevented in the future. The contrast between their earlier arrogance and this emerging self-awareness underscores a central psychological theme. Transformation emerges from acknowledgement of error. For the audience, these moments resonate deeply, as they mirror the process of learning from one's own cognitive biases and misjudgments in daily life. Civilians, too, demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Families rebuilt homes, neighbors shared tools and labor, and communities organized efforts to restore essential services. Every act of reconstruction, no matter how small, symbolized the triumph of human will over the destructive forces that had threatened to overwhelm them. Children returned to the streets with cautious laughter, carrying an innocence that had survived despite the terror they had witnessed. This reconstruction is more than physical, it is psychological. Survivors were forced to reconcile the trauma of recent events with the necessity of moving forward, reflecting a process of emotional resilience that mirrors historical and personal human experiences alike. The audience is drawn into empathy, recognizing that growth often requires navigating fear, loss, and uncertainty. Amid the ruins, subtle lessons emerged that transcended the immediate context of war. The general's errors illustrated the dangers of cognitive bias, overconfidence, confirmation bias, and normalcy bias, while the civilians' responses highlighted adaptability, cooperation, and emotional intelligence. The narration draws parallels between these historical events and contemporary life, emphasizing relevance to mental health, relationships, and self-improvement. Just as the generals had to confront their assumptions, viewers are encouraged to consider their own patterns of judgment, moments when overconfidence or complacency may have led to unnecessary suffering, and the ways in which humility and reflection can prevent repetition of similar mistakes. The contrast framing, transformation versus stagnation, understanding versus confusion, provides both narrative depth and psychological insight, keeping the audience engaged while prompting reflection. Communities began to memorialize what had been lost, not as a dwelling in sorrow, but as a method of processing and learning from trauma. Plaques, gardens, and ceremonies were established to honor lives disrupted or destroyed, providing symbolic closure. These rituals reflected the universal human need to make meaning from chaos, to impose order upon disorder, and to create narratives that reinforce identity and resilience. The audience is encouraged to see these efforts as microcosms of personal growth, acknowledging mistakes, accepting responsibility, and transforming experience into insight and action. The contrast between devastation and restoration, between grief and hope, highlights the emotional arc of the narrative and the psychological journey of recovery. In private, some generals engaged in personal reflection, journaling their thoughts and experiences. They documented their misjudgments, the moments of hesitation, the assumptions that had blinded them, and the pivotal decisions that altered the course of events. This reflective practice illustrates the psychological process of internalization, taking external events and using them as tools for self-awareness and growth. Viewers are prompted to consider their own lives, which patterns of thought or habitual decisions might benefit from similar scrutiny, and how the recognition of cognitive biases can improve decision-making, relationships, and emotional well-being. Rebuilding was not limited to structures and routines. It extended to relationships. Families that had been separated during the chaos reunited, and bonds formed under duress were strengthened by shared survival and mutual support. Trust, communication, and empathy became central pillars for communities and individuals alike. The narrative emphasizes the psychological principle that trauma, when navigated thoughtfully, can catalyze growth, deepen social connections, and foster emotional resilience. By portraying these dynamics in vivid, relatable terms, the audience experiences both catharsis and guidance, understanding that adversity, though painful, can lead to lasting transformation. Even in the midst of recovery, the generals faced external scrutiny. Allies, historians, and surviving civilians evaluated the decisions made, the consequences of error, and the steps taken to mitigate damage. These evaluations, often critical, provided an additional layer of psychological reflection. They forced acknowledgement that transformation is not merely internal, but also relational. Accountability to others reinforces learning and prevents repetition of past mistakes. Contrast framing remains central here. The shame of prior overconfidence versus the empowerment of newfound awareness, the chaos of error versus the structure of reflection and correction. This duality reinforces the theme of human growth emerging from the ashes of misjudgment. As weeks turned into months, cities slowly returned to life, markets reopened, children attended schools, and the rhythms of daily existence resumed, albeit with an undercurrent of caution informed by recent experiences. The generals, now tempered by reflection and humility, approached decision-making with increased vigilance, balancing confidence with evidence and authority with empathy. Civilians, having endured trauma and disruption, cultivated resilience that would guide future generations. The narrative emphasizes the long-term psychological effects of such transformation, illustrating that lessons learned from adversity, whether historical, personal, or relational, have enduring value. In the final stages of this resolution, the narrative draws explicit parallels between historical lessons and personal psychological insights. Overconfidence and underestimation, though dramatic in the context of war, mirror common patterns in everyday life, ignoring red flags in relationships, underestimating challenges at work, or dismissing emotional cues that signal imbalance. Viewers are invited to internalize these lessons, seeing the narrative not merely as a historical recounting, but as a reflective mirror for their own cognition, behavior, and emotional development. The contrast between stagnation and adaptation underscores the importance of conscious awareness, self-reflection, and proactive growth. The section concludes by emphasizing that recovery, understanding, and growth are ongoing processes. The devastation witnessed may have ended, but the lessons remain active within individuals and communities. Generals, civilians, and the audience alike are encouraged to integrate these lessons into future actions and decisions. Calm, reflective, and inspiring narration provides emotional closure, while reinforcing psychological insight. The audience departs with a sense of completion, having observed resilience, transformation, and internalization of lessons, ready to enter the concluding reflections that tie together the entire journey. The echoes of war gradually faded, leaving behind a landscape both scarred and renewed. Cities, once reduced to rubble, rose again, their streets bustling with life. Laughter cautiously returned to the squares, and smoke replaced by the gentle swirl of morning fog. Yet amid this physical rebuilding, the deeper lessons of perception, overconfidence, and the human mind endured, etched not in stone or steel but in memory, reflection, and collective consciousness. The generals, civilians, and historians alike came to understand that the true battle often exists not in the skies above or the streets below, but within the mind itself. How easily pride blinds judgment, how subtly assumptions distort reality, how persistent denial can amplify the consequences of error. These are truths that transcend the historical moment, touching every individual who dares to reflect on their own choices. Contrast frames the narrative even in this closing reflection. From the chaos of destruction to the clarity of lessons learned, from confusion to careful understanding, the journey of both people and mind is illuminated. The general's hubris, once a fortress of false confidence, gave way to humility tempered by experience. Civilians, whose lives had been threatened and reshaped, discovered resilience and adaptability that would guide them for years to come. The audience is invited to witness these transformations and, in doing so, to consider their own patterns of thought. What assumptions have gone unexamined? Where have overconfidence or denial influenced decisions in work, relationships, or personal growth? These questions linger, subtle yet insistent, leaving a reflective space in the minds of viewers. The narration, calm and poetic, emphasizes the quiet power of introspection. Observers are guided gently to contemplate not only what occurred historically, but also the universality of human cognitive patterns, overconfidence, normalcy bias, and the blind spots of perception are not limited to generals or civilians. They reside in every mind, shaping choices large and small. By presenting these lessons alongside vivid imagery of destruction and reconstruction, the narrative allows the audience to feel both the gravity of error and the hope inherent in learning and adaptation. Psychological hooks subtly encourage empathy, curiosity, and self-awareness, fostering engagement that extends beyond the video itself. Ultimately, the conclusion underscores that growth and understanding are ongoing processes. Just as cities rebuild and communities heal, so too can minds recover, evolve, and learn from experience. The journey from fear to resilience, from misjudgment to insight, mirrors the universal human experience. We stumble, we fail, we reflect, and through this cycle, we grow. This reflective closure leaves viewers with a sense of emotional satisfaction and lasting impact, prompting them to carry forward the lessons of vigilance, humility, and introspection into their own lives. In the final moments, the audience is left with both a sense of resolution and a gentle challenge to recognize personal blind spots, to question assumptions, and to cultivate awareness in every decision. The narrative concludes not with despair or triumph alone, but with the quiet certainty that human perception, while fallible, holds the power for a continual refinement and growth. From chaos to clarity, confusion to peace, the story closes with a meditation on the resilience of mind and spirit, leaving an impression that is both thought-provoking and emotionally resonant, compelling viewers to reflect, empathize, and share the insights that history and psychology offer.